Welcome to the Maintainable Software Podcast, where we explore the art of improving existing software with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations overcome the problems often associated with technical debt and legacy code. I'm your host, Robby Russell. On this episode, Austin Story, who works on Doximity's product platform team as a senior engineering director and speaker. Austin joins us from sunny Seattle in the United States, not too far north of me. Austin Story, we're so glad to have you join us on Maintainable. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here and talk to you.
So as you reflect on your experience in the industry, what do you believe are a few common characteristics of, dare I say, well-maintained software?
It's a pretty wide spectrum of maintainable software. I'd say at a high level, I think in more terms of business value. So something that is functional and the team can iterate on it at the speed that, the higher ups need in order to deliver something to customers, whatever that means. And then more tactically, whenever I'm working inside of code, something that is tested, it's easy to remove, and as simple as it can be to fulfill whatever use case it needs to do at the time.
Can you tell me a little bit more about how would you classify something as being easy to remove?
So something that's easy to remove means that, at a high level, you're following more of like the solid principles. So if you add a feature and whenever it's possible, make it isolated and easy to be, injected in and used in a single place or multiple places in different ways. And I find that whenever I'm going in to remove a feature, if it requires me knowing how that feature is distributed across the entire system and used in multiple different ways, it's something that's harder for the team to iterate on because it gives a lot of places where it can, leave little landmines for other developers whenever they change something in one way in one place, but forget to change it somewhere else.
So is a safe assumption that you get to work in an environment where you're able to have the time to remove features?
I don't know if privilege is the right word. I do feel pretty lucky to be where I'm at. When we do remove features from time to time, whether it's like an entire product suite that's not working out or, something that we've tried that just hasn't worked out. So I try to be very intentional whenever I'm making things to build them in that way, not to make them easy to remove, but if it's easy to remove, then generally it's easier for other people to iterate on that as well.
Interesting. So it's not often the situation where you're not just constantly pivoting the thing until the point where it becomes not useful anymore, but you're able to rethink how you're approaching something for the business and be like, that strategy didn't quite work. Let's try something different. And rather than mold the thing that didn't quite work into this messy version of it or a different version, you're just like, let's start. So is it almost like a rewrite in that situation, or is it just a completely different paradigm that you're thinking about?
A lot of it really just depends on, what you're adding. But whenever I'm adding something, I tend to follow the acronym YAGNI, which is, you ain't going to need it. And so whenever I'm building something, I try to make it the most simple thing that it possibly can be to get done what needs to be done. And once that thing's out there, it's working, it's functional, it's fulfilling what it needs to do. And then we get new requirements, And based on the amount of changes that I need to make, or how much that code resists being changed, that informs whether or not I need to rethink how I'm approaching it. And if I go into something and it's calcified, it's hard to change. If it's a simple feature, I'll be like, okay, I'm going to add this. But, if I have to change this again, then I'm going to change the way that I'm approaching it. I'll make the change easy, and then I'll make the easy change.
That makes a lot of sense. So one of the things I wanted to dive into with you is maybe talk about some specific projects that I know that you've been involved in. And I know that you've worked on a project to migrate a monolithic GraphQL server to a federated architecture. First of all, what's the difference for those of us listening that might not know what that distinction is? And what sort of challenges led to that decision? And how did you go about that migration?
GraphQL at a high level, it's essentially like a formalized REST endpoint. So it's a way for clients to make requests into like a REST endpoint, but they make it in the form of the keys on a JSON document. And the server responds in the way that it needs to assemble that data. And that system's been really great for us, GraphQL in general. It adds some complexity. So, it's not like a silver bullet, but where it's really helped us is with mobile. So, a lot of, Doximity, most of our users are medical professionals, and they're generally very busy people. So they use us where they want to be met at, which is on iOS, Android devices. And that GraphQL system, because it's such a a well thought out formalized spec, it allows on the back end for us to record all of the keys that have been requested. And we know when somebody's going to make a change to the graph, whether or not it's going to break existing mobile clients that are relying on those endpoints that are responding with those keys. So that's been exceptional for the mobile team. And it's also how they prefer to develop as well. If I'm contrasting that with REST, REST is very simple. You make a request to an API and it responds in a specific way, but it becomes hard to maintain those over time because you don't know what's being requested. And those REST endpoints are iterated on. They'll say something like, oh, well, let's add some sort of flag toggle, like skinny model true or something like that to give a different representation of it. And somebody misses that memo and it breaks a mobile client. It's a bad experience for, anybody using the app because it just breaks. So that's GraphQL at a high level. Now Federation, GraphQL is great for mobile because they can make the request and they don't have to care how the backend responds. GraphQL Federation is an extension of that such that you have a single endpoint that is essentially like a GraphQL router. And then you can have a series of microservices underneath that to serve the requests. Just like with GraphQL, it's not a silver bullet. It does add some complexity. But what it allows you to do is have any team add fields to those JSON requests in any way that they need to fulfill the client's needs. And they don't have to be as concerned with where it's being served from.
That's interesting. Yeah, I feel like not too long ago, I had a guest that talked a little bit about, referred to it as a super graph. How different is a super graph? Do you know, are you familiar with that term versus a federated?
I would say that a super graph is probably that monolith GraphQL where you have no specification for this. Before we did this migration, answering your question about the pain points that we were seeing, we kind of had a super graph there. So we had in our core monolith that has existed since pretty much the beginning of time for Doximity. It was the thing that was responsible for making those calls down to other microservices in order to fulfill, something like, serving like a newsfeed or something like that. What we saw whenever we had that sort of architecture is really two main points. The first one was from the developer standpoint. So in order to do something as simple as add a single field to a single part in that graph, what I want for that developer is for it to be a single change. Hey, you make a change in your microservice and you're done. But the reality is when you have that super graph, the core monolith has to know exactly what needs to happen in order for that request to be fulfilled. So it may require updating the microservice and then upgrading some gem, which is like a package in the Ruby world, in order to make that request. Then on the super graph, importing that gem, or updating the gem and mapping that into the field. So it was 3 to 4 changes for some teams in order to do something that should take, 15 or 20 minutes, just make a single change to pull your thing out and it'll work. So that's the developer side of it. And then from a resiliency standpoint, anytime that you're having a super graph that's responsible for all these things, let's imagine that you are on, let's say you're on a newsfeed team and you have another team, let's call it a profile team, somebody taking care of somebody's profile on a social network. The reasons that you want the newsfeed to be down ever are hopefully never, but realistically, you only want it to be down because your service is down. But whenever you add all of that complexity to a single place that's doing way more than just routing GraphQL requests, you have the potential for somebody else's team, some other team that you're not even working to, make a mistake somewhere and cause an outage that is completely unrelated to anything that you're doing. So after we ship this out, we have it to a point where, teams that are working in their own microservices can make a single change. We have all the orchestration to make that work in, development, staging, and production. And then it gets shipped out and it's available for their clients to use whenever they need to make the request.
Hey listeners, it's Robby here. It wasn't all that long ago. I'd find myself debugging a weird issue in one of our clients' Rails app. I log into one platform to track down the error, only to realize it was tied to some performance issue. And guess what? That meant hopping over into a completely different tool and trying to match things up based off of timestamps, if I was lucky. And let me tell you, My productivity didn't exactly thank me for that. Enter AppSignal, our podcast sponsor, and the tool that eliminates all that back and forth. They bring error tracking, performance monitoring, host metrics, custom metrics, uptime monitoring, and logging into one seamless platform. It's a single source of truth that helps keep your app running like a well-rehearsed symphony. Whether you're working with Ruby, Elixir, Node, Python, or tracking front-end errors in JavaScript, AppSignal has your back. They're always adding support for more languages and frameworks too. And here's the best part. AppSignal won't break the bank. Plans start at just $23 US a month. Plus, they're ISO 27001 certified and fully GDPR and HIPAA compliant, so your data is safe. Oh, and because you're a loyal Maintainable listener, you can use the promo code maintainable at checkout for 10% off your first year. So head over to appsignal.com, tell them that your good friend Robby from Maintainable sent you, and start making your app sing. I'll definitely include some links for folks in the show notes and get some links from you on that, just kind of like learning a little bit more about the federated approach. I know that keeping data and teams in particular in sync seems like a recurring type of challenge that we're always facing. So how do you approach improving collaboration between like the data teams and the application developers?
That's actually a very difficult problem because they're two different worlds. Like, so Doximity is, mostly a Rails-based system. All the teams and, the way that we set up our teams is very much like very small, isolated teams that can work on like a single part of the business. I like to think that Jeff Bezos said you like to keep your teams, small enough to feed them with 2 pizzas. Like we're big eaters. So we like smaller teams of, like 3 to 5 developers to push something out. And the data team, like we're working on in the Rails application side, we get our own data store, we get all of these things. We have active record, which is a pattern around your database to give it like lots of rich interactions. You get things that are called callbacks so that, like let's say you update your name, it knows, oh, hey, after this changes, I need to go update Elasticsearch or Neo4j or Redis or anything like that. But the data team on the other side, they tend to work in something like Snowflake, where they just have this giant database. They're doing a lot of experiments. Their stuff is normally like it's not all ad hoc, but there's a lot of ad hoc work. So like, one of the problems that we faced is, as you have these like extremely talented data scientists and data analysts and data engineers, they're, figuring out the best newsfeed card for, you, Robby, as you're using the site, how do they get that data back into the application system so that it can be served? And at RailsConf, I think it's 2021, I talked about this system called a data update tool, which we use for that. And it's a boundary layer in between those two systems. It's in Kafka. Kafka is not the most important part, but it's an exceptional system for this where, the data team, they're able to do all they need to do in Snowflake and work in the ways that make sense for Python, because it's just a different world over there than it is in the Rails organization, and create some contracts so that they can send a bunch of essentially commands to the Rails applications. So the data team gets to work in their world, and then the application developers, they just consume these commands and they get to rely on all the things that they need in order to get stuff done, so that whenever they get an update, they can do whatever they need to do in the business domain to make sure that that update, is consistent across their microservice.
Interesting. I'm curious about that. Dig into that if you're able to share. I'm curious about, so when your data science team is kind of doing things on the, whatever that nebulous thing is that they're doing over there to enriching the data, I suppose, is that kind of like a way you might phrase it? And then is that data then coming back into, you're then needing to update records in your Rails ecosystem a little bit to then to render or display this information or to send appropriate communication or to categorize people a bit differently? Or I always see like those data lake things being often in place to send stuff so people can do all the reporting and do other types of things in the organization. But I'm kind of curious about that push back into your system.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some enrichment, and then we also have the reporting aspect as well. But, I think the best way to explain it is, Doximity, one of our functions is as a social network for medical professionals, and similar to developers, medical professionals are interested in different things based on what field they're in. So like something that may get a Rubyist excited may not be the same thing that gets a Java programmer or a C programmer excited. The same thing's true for, physicians. An oncologist is going to be interested in different types of articles than, like a general practitioner. And those are things that we've learned over time of just doing this for, over a decade. And the data team, using that newsfeed example, they're able to determine, hey, this person's an oncologist. Here are the things that they've been interested in the past and the things that we know about this profession and this person. These are the things that we think would be interesting to them the most. And how do you get that back into the system? And that's just one of the use cases. I mean, there's, dozens and probably hundreds of use cases for things like this, but that's just an example of why they would want to push that data back in.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks for kind of digging into that more for me. I want to talk a little bit more about your work at Doximity. So what's your main focus as a senior engineering director of product platform? And how big is approximately how large of an engineering organization is it right at the moment?
My team, we have 16 people on the team right now. And
how many pizzas is that?
About 16 somewhere in that area. Really big eaters on that team. We have a lot of responsibilities. Like at a high level product platform, we say that our team is the team that builds the primitive so that Doximity developers can focus exclusively on just delivering value to physicians, making their lives easier, being able to focus on the business use cases and not having to deal with all of the tedious things that are involved to make sure that happens. Examples would be, authentication. We have microservices, GraphQL, we have all of these iOS applications. How do we make sure these teams can, authenticate in a single way and just work at a really tight, high-level API for whatever they're dealing with. And the same thing's true for email delivery. It's relatively complex to do that. We want teams to be able to just think about sending emails and not how the emails are sent.
Is your team responsible for things like keeping your Ruby on Rails applications updated, or is that in a different part of the engineering team?
So some of that. Rails is, like a gem in Ruby for people that aren't familiar. It's the web framework that all of the applications use. And there are some of those that we maintain and upgrade, like the really big ones that are essentially not owned by a single team, but teams that have their own microservice, they're responsible for their upgrades. So like the things that we really focus on, in addition to upgrading the big ones, which is not a small task by any stretch of the imagination, but we tend to think more in terms of like, how do we make this easier for the teams to maintain their own stuff? And that involves everything from how do you make sure the team knows that they need to update Rails? That may seem easy for some people, but it's actually quite hard whenever you end up with, dozens and dozens of applications, making sure that, a tech lead knows 6 or 9 months in advance, hey, you're going to need to upgrade Rails because it just hit, and you need to plan for this in your planning and, talk to the project manager so that they have time pulled out for you to do this.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think, when I talk a lot of it, because I work in the consulting space, we work with a lot of companies that struggle to find time because they're like, well, we just never have the time. And it sounds like I'm always kind of curious about like at what point teams get big enough where they can have people that are focused on reminding the other people on the team that this is coming down. We're going to, if we don't get this upgraded, we're going to be no longer getting security patches in 3 to 5 months or something. And or we've never figured out as a team how to do this. And that's a challenge for teams that like know that they can do it. And because a lot of engineers are hired kind of like after the thing's already been built to some degree, right? After something's been built. And so people come in later, which I want to get a little bit into onboarding as well. But thinking about how there's a lot of engineers out there that have never even been part of an upgrade project, let alone be like, well, where do I start? It's kind of like, how are we as an organization managing this and like who's responsible for that? And so it ends up being this interesting thing that seems like teams all have to figure out. And then they call companies like us and be like, can you just do it for us? And we're like, we can kind of help you with it, but you really need to figure this stuff out yourself too. I want to talk a little bit about, in particular, around things about guiding teams through big technical challenges. So for those that are kind of stepping into a new domain or organization, how do you help them, or how do you think about helping them quickly get up to speed with the business context and the domain knowledge, in addition to just how your team like works on software development and their practices?
The first thing is just a clear process that somebody can understand on how they get code into production. And, for us, it's a very well defined process. Like if we have a new developer, we have, absolute ownership of like the features that we deliver at Doximity. That is just one of the core things that we care about. So like somebody gets a story, they build the story, they push it out, they get code review, and that gives an opportunity for people that have more knowledge of bodies buried or landmines or, just to like let people know about other things that may exist. When somebody's coming on board, we give them a mentor that is there with them, helping them get up to speed, to know who to ask questions of, where to get help, and that sort of stuff. And then also on the team, like they will have somebody on their team as well that's helping them with this. And both those people have to sign off on those PRs that they make, or that the new developer makes. And that makes sure that, they feel comfortable making changes, like we want people to be shipping code, and then, in that process as well, it's going to be different for every organization, but because of the ownership on, the features and the results that we're pushing out, after a pull request is signed off on, we always require at least one reviewer on any change in our entire system. Then we push it to a QA team that validates it. And those are just a godsend because they not only know about everything that you're doing, but they know about everything that's happened in the past. As a developer, you're not exposed to all of the features. So they may be like, oh, this feature over here is broken. And, you as the developer, hopefully are like, thank you for preventing me from breaking something I wasn't aware of. And after they verify it, you're the person that writes out what the expectations are, but they're smart enough and they're deep enough in the business domain to know other areas that it could touch.
I was thinking about, you brought up like QA and how that can be such a godsend in some ways. And I'm just now thinking about, like, I talk so much with people about thinking about onboarding engineers, but like thinking about the scenario where you need to kind of onboard new QA people to an organization and helping them get up to speed. I'm like, that sounds really complicated. And to need to replace someone that's been there for a long time is you potentially could lose a lot of context there. And that could be pretty tricky, I think, probably too. Have you had any experiences like that before?
With getting new QAs on board? Yeah, it is hard, especially on some of our teams that, for product platform, we have teams that are more focused on enablement, and then we have teams that are more focused on like product. The authentication one's a good example of that because it's very deep and wide, and it has to be correct. There's no wiggle room. It's like, hey, this has to absolutely work all the time, but it's similar to the developers. It's mostly them getting exposure to increasingly complex stories, like you give them something small, something a little bit bigger, and you just keep expanding their brain till they have at least like most of the stuff that they need to know in order to get stuff out there.
Now, I know that you've spent much of your career building SaaS products, so I like to dig into that. I work in the consulting space, and some of our clients are SaaS products, but for the most part, I've kind of stayed out of that particular world. So I'm out of curiosity, from your perspective, what are some of the common challenges teams face when building or maintaining SaaS platforms, rather than say I'll just kind of leave it there as an open question.
You mean more for like smaller apps?
Yeah.
I would say infrastructure is a big one, and billing is always a big one as well. The authentication, those are some of the bigger ones. Luckily in Rails, the Ruby on Rails world, like a lot of these things are kind of already figured out, with like Heroku and Pundit Devise and a few of the other gems that we use. But I'd say those are the bigger ones. Also, most of the time that I'm working with SaaS, it's normally with somebody that's junior, that's just got like a really good idea that I'm mentoring. And I at least find that I take for granted some of the things that I've learned. A lot of times I just assume somebody understands what all the context that I have, and that's not always the case.
We'll be back with our interview with Austin in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robby. I wanted to take a quick moment to say thank you. Thank you for making time to listen to the podcast. If you're finding these discussions valuable, please consider sharing a link amongst your peers and/or writing a review on Apple Podcasts to help spread the word. Also, is there someone you think I should have on the podcast? Shoot me an email to Robby with a Y at maintainable.fm. And now, let's get back to our interview with Austin Story. One of the things you mentioned was billing, and I'm curious if you have any strong opinions about how to say, if you're having, let's say, if you took a typical SaaS product, maybe built with Ruby on Rails, would you take the approach of immediately wanting to integrate directly with Stripe and use the Stripe gem, or do you have a different perspective, having been around for a while, and like how to think about how you will account for billing that works for the near term and some of the stuff that pops up down the road, because getting paid for your product is an important part of business?
A lot of that is going to depend on the case. I mean, I've used Stripe. It's pretty easy to integrate with Recurly as well. But, similar to how whenever you're trying to automate something, you can artificially automate it by just doing it manually. Like if you only have a couple of customers, I made the mistake on one SaaS product that I built out. This was like 2012, and it was a big learning experience. So this was a SaaS product that was targeted at lawyers, and we had these like illusions of grandeur that we were going to basically like hang up a shingle, and like people were going to be coming through the gate, like just knocking down our doors trying to get in, and it was very difficult. Like the sales part of SaaS is by far the hardest thing to me. Getting people to actually give you money and finding the people that will give you money is hard. And I had this very nice thing built with, at the time, like Recurly was, like kind of like the competitor to Stripe. With Recurly, like people could easily sign up and, go in and do all their configuration and this like really nice dashboard. And it was easy and simple. And what I learned from that is we didn't end up with hundreds of clients. We ended up with dozens. And all of those clients actually preferred a consultation with them to set it up, to make sure that it was configured in the way that they needed to be configured. So like all of this stuff is basically still just like, even though it's like a WYSIWYG editor, it's my partner goes in and configures all this stuff for somebody else.
Well, that's the white glove onboarding experience, I suppose, kind of guiding them through that. But I was curious about that, thinking about integrating with different tools, because we find ourselves working on different projects. Sometimes we're like, okay, well, the developers, it made sense. So we'll just slap Stripe in there. That works really well for what we need right now. And they've got customers, but then as soon as they start dealing with, say, maybe international customers, then weird things start to pop up. And then our clients are coming to us and being like, hey, why is this so expensive for us to integrate with PayPal now? When I just want to get paid, how do we make it easy to send me money? And it's just like this, well, the number of times the Stripe ID shows up in your database to make everything work is like this, and that's a completely different. Multiple payment processors was not part of the original plan because it was just what was easier for the developer at the time. Anyways, I'm going off on a weird tangent here, and we can move on. But it's just like something I've been thinking a little bit about. Like, how do you help the community think about these? You don't want to prematurely optimize as well, because as you were just saying, like sometimes you're like, maybe some of your clients need invoices and they're going to send you a wire, and how does that work? Or maybe that should be your first handful of customers, anyways. But
yeah, there's a good gem in the Rails community called Pay, and that tries really hard to integrate multiple payment processors, but it is a very complicated problem. So, I mean, if I was coaching somebody, I would say keep it as simple as you possibly can until you don't need it to be that simple, and then figure it out then. And as you're building it out, if you can build it out without directly referencing those things, kind of like how you think about building out like a tight API. It's like make the API very solid, and then your internals can change so that instead of connecting directly on like a foreign key of like a Stripe identifier, you do just a join table of like the payment identifier, and then then you can actually refactor that without having to change your entire application in order to integrate those things.
Earlier you mentioned thinking about encouraging ownership when people are joining an organization, and creating a sense of ownership among team members can be challenging, I would imagine at times. But how do you foster that? I mean, it's one thing to say like we have a culture, but what are some of the things how does your team think about that and instilling that sort of accountability for the results of their work?
Yeah, I think leadership through example is the only answer there. If that's a value that somebody has and they think that it's important, I certainly do. I try to demonstrate that through my actions. And whenever I'm talking to, like my team, it's something that I talk about. Like we don't talk about, how many points did you deliver? Or like, hey, did you build this thing out? It's did we get results from the project that we pushed out? That's the measure of our time, that we're spending on things. It's like,
is it super obvious on the type of work that your team's working on that they know how to answer that question in terms of like seeing the results versus like, hey, I was working on, someone puts a story in, it gets organized and we get to work on it, but like, are they able to quite often see the results themselves, or does that sometimes require talking to whoever in the product team might have requested that, or is there a little bit of a lag there, or at least like, how do you think about that?
I think a lot of it works with working with the people directly. So instead of treating it as a wall, like I've been in organizations where it's, hey, I developed a thing and I'm punting it over the wall and now I deal with it and I'm wiping my hands with it. And that really does a disservice, I think, to everybody. You don't get the feedback to actually make your thing useful by the other person. And then the other person may or may not have even the time to use your thing. So you have to find a way to shim the thing that you're building, hopefully at the point that you're building it, you've had enough discussions with people asking like really pointed questions for whether it's valuable or not. So let's assume that we've all agreed it's something that we need. You find a way to work with a team that needs that and actually implement it with them. Get it in their system, get them actually using it, making sure that the APIs that you're exposing make sense. Make sure that whenever they're pushing it out there, that there's not this like complete blind spot that you missed because you're not on the product team. You're on, this support team building stuff for people. And I think that closes the gap a lot. And then that follow through of, not just doing it once, but doing it over and over and over again until it's actually out there and it's used and enough people have that critical mass of the thing that you're pushing out there.
That makes sense. You make a good point there that I don't think I was really accounting for in my question there, which was quite often it sounds, maybe I might be wrong, but my assumption is that quite often your, say, air quoting customers or clients that you're working for or other developers in the organization. And so you understand their role, what they're trying to accomplish probably a lot easier than someone working with your customer, like your external customer or whatever clients, and like you might not have, or the people like, some product owners somewhere else in the organization. So is that like, oh, they're able to use the API updates that we made, or that's a much quicker feedback loop, it sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's less about, hey, we're exposing these APIs for you to use. And it's more people are using these APIs and they're able to get stuff done faster because of that,
At what size of an organization do you think teams should consider, say, isolate, but carve out some portion of the team or a percentage of the team to focus on things like this, where it's like more platform specific things versus everybody working, on the backlog for shipping things to everything being kind of in the same group versus kind of splitting that up?
I don't know if I can say that definitively. I think the big, I guess, litmus there would be how much of your application does every developer have in their head? And as that gets much, much, much larger, the natural tendency is to start splitting like a larger team, say 10 or 15 developers into like a couple different focuses. And whenever you split that focus up, that's whenever the need for somebody coordinating that. And it doesn't have to be a separate team. This is just what has, been working for us. I mean, yeah. So once it gets to a point where you can't give a story to somebody and them understand where it's at in the system, that's whenever having a central person thinking about this sort of stuff, because what can happen, and you don't want to be like over prescriptive with things. I'm not saying like you want to, like you got to be adaptive with most things and like prescriptive on the important things like that GraphQL project that we mentioned. But as you're seeing the commonalities between the two teams, what can happen is, you imagine like you have, let's say team A and team B. Team A is like, hey, we need authentication. Team B is like, I need authentication. Team A builds authentication. Team B is authentication. And one of them built a bridge and one of them built a tunnel. And they just can't meet it all. Or like maybe one of them builds a bridge in one direction and then the other one starts building a bridge in the complete opposite direction, or in a way where they just they're incompatible to meet in the middle. That is very expensive because you had two entire teams focused on building out a complete feature set that needed to be unified because it's all one organization. At the end of the day, for Doximity, we're one organization. Doctors don't think of us as the specific team that's shipping a feature. They think, hey, I log in it with Doximity and I'm able to use these features,
When you're working on a project, how do you approach clarifying those types of requirements to ensure alignment across, the various teams?
Talking with stakeholders is the top thing. I mean, in terms of like weeding out projects and making sure that they're important, we have a very structured format for this. So we do quarterly planning, and the planning's very agile though. So we approach it in like hey, over the next quarter, our teams are going to work, like each team lead makes their own roadmap. They're the product owner for their domain. Say, absent something changing, here is exactly what we're going to do this quarter. And then we stay flexible for if somebody comes to us, there's another opportunity that comes up that's more important or is going to add more value. But for every single goal, I find clarifying who it came from. And that's important. That weeds out like 90% of the projects, because if something's like, hey, this came from our VP of product, it's probably been thought out in some way, but if you're like, hey, this came from my brain, it's like, well, like how do you know that this is going to be something that's important? And after that, it's, how long do you think it's going to take? Like some sort of estimate on it. We have some major focuses on our team that, I asked the team leads to say, hey, how does this tie directly to like the things that we're focusing on as our umbrella, which is just our team, the product platform. And then a description of the goal. And that description should be good enough such that either a developer can come in and read it and understand what you're doing, or a product person can come in and understand what you're doing. The value, calling that out. I know this is a lot I'm throwing up on you, but the value, like, so at the end of this, like once this is completely, what do you expect to get out of this? And then the very last part are goalposts. And that is specific measurable things that will tell you when this thing is done. And with all of that information, we're able to have very easy conversations. It's like, hey, you said that this was going to take 12 weeks. We've got like 6 things here and the value is this. It's like, can we hit? But by saying yes to these 12 weeks, we're also saying no to like several other of these goals. Is there any way to like shim this down to like 4 weeks and only get some of the stuff and then push the other part of it later? And it works really well for us.
Hey folks, it's Robby here. I want to take a moment to tell you about my company, Planet Argon. Think of us as your trusted travel agency for software projects, helping legacy applications find their way to exciting new destinations. Need a quick getaway? We offer staff augmentation to get the extra hands you need. Planning a longer journey? Our fractional development services are perfect for keeping things running smoothly without overpacking your team. We specialize in technologies like Ruby on Rails, React, and Laravel. So if you know of a company whose software feels stuck in economy, held back by technical debt, or in need of new features, send them our way. We'll help them upgrade to first-class solutions and arrive at their destination in style. Visit us at planetargon.com. Again, that's planetargon.com. All right, let's get back to the show. And don't forget, every great journey starts with the right plan. That's great. Coincidentally, I was chatting with a new consulting client a couple hours ago, and they're in this position where they're trying to figure out how closely their stakeholders should be interacting with their developers, because they brought on a lot of new developers more recently. And one of the things that they're kind of like trying to navigate is like, how do we shield the developers so they have time to focus on some stuff and not, but also knowing that the product people are not always able to get their stories or their specifications organized far enough in advance, and then also like to a certain point where they'll put a thing in and like they all think that it's going to be X, but they know that they need to have time to review and then react to what the developers put together, and then they'll probably have a couple of small requests afterwards. Does that stuff kind of happen in your environment where even though you have very clear goals and specific measurables, but like by the time it gets to a review state of some sort, you're like, well, now that we're actually interacting with this, we need to have like the scope might change a little bit? Is that still something you kind of experience, or is that less likely because just the way your pipeline of work is mapped out that you're like, well, that'll come up. We can come back to that and then in the future at some point.
I mean, anytime that you're in a business that is iterating and changing and there's opportunities that come up, you need to be flexible with this. So that's why whenever we make these goals, we're not, at least I don't hold people's feet. I'm not like, oh, you said this was going to be 2 weeks and you were going to do these 3 things. It's like, no, like this is so we can have a conversation about where we want to invest our time. Like where is the best place we can put our time to push Doximity forward as an organization through helping developers or building products or covering down on different things. So whenever something changes, we call an audible, just like in football. You've got timeouts. Hey, something has changed here. And then have a discussion. And then we say, okay, well, has this changed in a fundamental way where we need to adjust the goal? Or has something else came up that we need to work on instead and we need to push pause on this? And having that, I guess that trust and that integrity in your team where they feel comfortable and they know they're not going to get like whammered by, bringing these things up. That communication makes it very simple, at least from my perspective, for somebody to come in and say, hey, Austin, this other thing came up. What do you think about it? It's like, oh yeah, definitely. Let's shift over to that and knock it out. And either, I can cover down on this other thing or we can find somebody else on the team to cover down.
Do you think that sort of confidence is primarily more of a cultural thing, or do you think that comes primarily with developers as they have the experience to have that sort of confidence to call a timeout and be like, wait a minute, and rather than being like just fulfilling the request of whatever ticket that they got assigned?
I think it's definitely cultural. Like from a leader's perspective, like least the way I look at this, like my job is to foster an environment where people are happy and able to get stuff done. So the people that come on the team, they have to be people that want to be happy and get stuff done. This is sort of environment, and like that's different for every single person. But those common things of just communicating with people, making it clear that like, hey, I'm here, like whatever my title is, like I'm here to help us get something done. And as so long as it's an us thing and a we and not a I, that tends to help, I think.
Do you find that then is like a thing that you're able to help train people up culturally, or is it something you try to suss out in your interviewing process?
Definitely try to suss it out in interviewing. It's very difficult to do, but it's more of a trained thing, like, because even somebody that comes in, it takes a while to build up that level of trust from somebody, for people to actually like believe that you want what's right for them. And it does take quite a bit of time. And, like whenever someone comes into like a team lead position on the team, like they're normally a little worried for a little bit, because it's like, this ominous thing, tech lead or, engineering manager or something along those lines. But over time, following that process, like with the quarterly planning and then seeing everybody else on the team leading by example, even the people that are individual contributors, we try to keep things flat and not, throw around like titles or pull rank on somebody. I think that's silly, like respect as people, as individuals, for the things that they can do, and, letting them try things and, sometimes fail, but, shooting for, delivering really excellent software, like that's what we want people to do.
One of the things I wanted to touch on with you as well is around how to help teams avoid bike shedding. So, and trying to stay focused on meaningful work. So how do you kind of think about that in terms of like advice that are kind of like keeping meetings and code reviews, things like that, productive, and kind of avoiding those kind of distractions that might pop up within software development teams?
Something that I do is encourage people to, every quarter look through their calendar and say, are any of these meetings that I'm in not serving? And if they have the power to delete those meetings, to delete them and thank them for the time that they had and remove all of that cruft. I like to keep a very, low touch. My team leads run their teams the way that they want to. But, in general, what works for us is we have one meeting once a week where everybody syncs up, and it's less of a, hey, here's what I'm doing, because we can see that like every day we post like what we're working on, but it's more of a, here's what I'm running into, and trying to get feedback from the other people on the team for a way that they're approaching the problem or something that they're running into. And, the team leads and mentors are there to help them make decisions on that. So just, I guess, discouraging meetings is a good way to prevent the bike shedding. It's very easy to fill your day up with meetings. And once that happens, like, you're not going to get anything done. You're just going to be talking about doing things, which is the opposite of what we want.
Yes, I can appreciate that. So for the most part, is your team fairly asynchronous then, remotely distributed?
Yeah, like Doximity in general is a very remote company. Even before the pandemic, we were, I think, 60% remote. It's much higher now. I don't know what the number is, but probably I'd wager in the high 80s or somewhere in that area. But that asynchronous, and, at least on my teams, we like those goals that I mentioned where they're definite goalposts and value, and we've all talked through them ahead of time. Like most developers just like grabbing one of those and then just shipping the entire thing. Like, so they are responsible for breaking it up. And the things that we encourage to do that is, try to ship one thing every day. Break it down into small enough increments so that you can get it out there and start getting feedback from people, or ship it out with the proper controls so that you can do it safely and those sorts of things.
A couple of quick last questions for you. I want to get some advice from you for those listening. So let's say there's a couple of people out there listening are in a situation where maybe they've been in an organization for a while and they're not working in this they don't feel like they're able to be as productive on, I'd say, a daily basis. And maybe but there's maybe some friction when it comes to within the technology stack itself, or how something in there, but they feel like they've advocated and raised their hand a couple of times, that, hey, could we address this at some point? And they heard not right now a few times. And so they just assume now that meant like never. And so they've stopped asking. What advice could you offer them on how to maybe start taking some action today rather than just say looking for a new job?
Something that's been successful for us is we have a concept of 30% time for product teams. And with that 30% time, that is dedicated time every quarter, 30%. So it should be roughly 30% of the developer's time to handle all of those things that need to happen to make sure that you can continue to ship software effectively for the business. So, the team leads, if they're effective, are making sure that that time is accounted for in the product manager's plans, and if they're able to do that, which they should be, that's where you can get those upgrades, any bug fixes, anything that's technical that needs to happen. Like that's a good bucket of time in order to make sure that that's happening. And if for some reason the person that's responding to this is more of like a bean counter, and they're not okay with that, advocating for the speed and reliability that you get through having tools that are, if I had a couple days to refactor this, I could do this in 15 minutes. But, because it's the way that it is and I have to touch all these different files and all this sort of stuff, it's going to take me a day every time you want this change. And if it's somebody that's more of a bean counter, then they can more easily say, okay, I have 5 of these changes. You're telling me I can get those in 2.5 days through this change that's 5 full days, and it's still expensive in the future.
Mm-hmm. No, I like that. So I think that's some good advice for folks. Kind of like a little less technical. Is there a non-software, non-technical book that you recommend to your peers to read?
Oh boy, the mom test. That is, talking about SaaS. It's incredible. At its root, it is, whenever you have an idea, and I use this, in my role as like in product platform, you don't talk to the person about your solution. You talk to them about their problems. And the example that they use is, hey, mom, I've got this idea. It's Facebook for cats. Would you use that? And your mom, hopefully, if you have a mom and she's nice, she's not going to be like, that's an awful idea. I would never use that application. She's going to say, yes, I would love to use that application. And then you go, tinker on your computer for days and days and days, and you come up and then it lands with a bounce because nobody wants Facebook cats, So instead of talking about that product, you talk about, hey, this would be a weird conversation, but, hey, have you ever thought about, getting your cat, other cat friends or something? How do you get your cat out there to meet other cats?
I'm not sure if I've heard of that book before, but I'll definitely include links to that in the show notes for everybody. That sounds interesting. Where can people best follow your thoughts and ruminations about software engineering online?
Twitter or X, and it's Osteo36.
I will definitely have links for everybody in the show notes. And with that, it's been such a delight having you join us on Maintainable. Thank you so much for stopping by to talk shop with us, Austin.
Thanks so much, Robby. Have a good one.
Maintainable.